Welcome to our Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Adele Ahlberg Calhoun. Adele is the author of the splendid Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. I wonder if you could maybe begin by telling us a wee bit then about your background and how you came to Christ and his church then, Adele.
Um, so I was brought up in the bosom of the church and was at church 3 times a week for many, many years and had, I think, the normal kinds of doubts and things as you go into university. And are there other ways? Is God who God says he is? And, did a deep dive and came out saying, um, this makes sense to me more than anything else. And as I look at it now, I think, well, I really had some faith in my reason, maybe more than faith in God at the time. But, God is generous and receives you where you are. So that was I plunged in, and then I taught high school for a year and then said, well, God, if you want me, I'm happy to do anything you want. And long story short, I ended up working with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students in Southeast Asia and the Mideast for 2.5 years. And then I went to seminary and then again did another time in Trinidad in the West Indies, again working with university students, and eventually ended up, my husband and I pastoring, co-pastoring and pastoring in various churches, which is what I've done for the past 50 years. So here I am
That's
today.
brilliant.
Retired, but having plenty to do.
I'm sure. Ask what then initially inspired you to write the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook, and how has your understanding of some of the spiritual practices maybe evolved over the years?
So I really had a crisis of faith when I was pastoring in Boston, um, in a ministry to young adults, post-college, uh, graduate students and young professionals. And they would come to talk to me about their faith and questions they had, and they would have a presenting issue, and they would say what it is, and I would, talk to them and drop some pearl of wisdom, and they would, oh, that's so helpful, and then they would go, and then I'd feel good, and they'd feel good, and then maybe 2 months later, 3 months later, they'd come back with a new presenting issue, and I would do the same, some pearl of wisdom. Oh, this is so helpful, and away they go. And this went on for about a couple of years. And I thought, the thing about this is that I am giving them a new piece of information each time, and I am feeding an addiction.
Mm.
This addiction in the Boston area, very educated area, that information can fix you. And that something new gives your brain a little rush. Those gray cells go, wow. But then that information becomes old information. And I thought, I don't see people really being transformed. So I spent some time thinking about what do I see? And I thought, really what I see is people who have like a distance between their head and their heart. They don't know how to connect this piece. Or they have this sense of, I don't think God loves me. I mean, I know it says God loves me, but I don't have any uh, apprehending of that love for me or what that looks like. And then the third piece was this sense of not knowing what to do with suffering. And how could a good God let this happen to me? So I thought, I don't know how to answer those things in a way that's transformative. I just know that what I'm doing is not enough. So I went to the senior pastor of the church and said, I need to resign. He says, hold on, hold on. Why are you going to resign? And I said, I don't see people with real life change happening. I see good people learning things. They're Christians. They want to follow Jesus, but I don't see them learning how to grapple with their lives in ways that take them deep into God. They're still in their head, and I'm just feeding their addiction. And he said, well, what do you want to do about it? And I said, well, I think I would like to go interview people in Boston, pastors, Christian organizations, to ask them how they see transformation, life change happening in people around them. And he said, well, do that. Don't resign. Go do that. And I'll give you money if you need to do that, but I don't want you to leave. So I spent some time going to various organizations and talking to people. Um, the church I was at is right downtown Boston. It's right next to a Catholic church. I went to the Catholic church. I went to anybody that I could think of who could help me say, what do you see? And very long story short, through that, I ended up being trained as a spiritual director, which for me was a very new way of apprehending God. The quiet, the contemplative path, the attending to the motion of God in your soul. What is that? How do you attend to the motion of God in your soul? And being exposed to a whole stream of the Christian tradition that was running parallel to sort of the Reformed tradition that I had been in. That's a long answer, but that is how I ended up in with a focus more on practice-based spirituality than
Mhm.
head-based spirituality, and in embodied living rather than theory and debate living.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing, Adele. And that's something that really resonates with me. James K. Smith has this wonderful expression, we're not just brains on sticks, and it's not just about information, but formation. And that word you used, apprehend, Malcolm Guite, the poet, he uses that alongside comprehend also. So you're tying together so many different things that I love and I've been moved by him. There's just a from some folks within the church that spiritual disciplines are a kind of work, so to speak. But I think you made clear that that isn't the case. I wonder if you might tell us about that and how we can receive these as gifts that God has given us for our flourishing, or I don't want to put the words in your mouth, but
No, no, I think that's a great, Marcus. And um, so what interested me as I was introduced to various spiritual practices, we're very familiar with Bible reading, prayer, worship, um, Bible study. That was sort of the menu.
Mhm.
And it's a good menu, it shaped and formed me. So I have nothing but good to say about it. I'm just going to say it's like eating four things when there is a meal that is a whole smorgasbord of different things that you can eat. And then looking at the life of Jesus and how often in his interaction with people, he would ask them what they wanted him to do for them. What do you want me to do for you? I want to see. What do you want me to do for you? Um, I want to be healed. What do you want me to do for you? I want you to put my sons on your right and your left. People asking various things. And Jesus saw desire, I think, as the fuel for spiritual growth, because we know we do what we want to do. If I want to run a marathon, I know it's hard. But I will get up every day and practice running because I want it. Or if I want to speak Spanish, I will practice so I can speak Spanish. So related to any sort of growth in an area is there a practice that gets me there? And I think part of the misunderstanding of things, like people will say, I want patience. That's a fruit of the spirit. That's a great thing to want. Well, is there a practice that helps me practice patience? Or am I just praying, God, give me patience, give me patience, give me patience? But then I'm never waiting. I'm never practicing holding back on making a decision. I'm not entering into um, a way of opening myself to God. And sometimes I'm actually expecting God to be like Albus Dumbledore and go, abracadabra, now you're patient. No, patience comes from practice. So I see Jesus involved in practices himself. And so this this thing of how do you get people to practice things? They'd say, oh, it'd be great to learn walking prayer, or it'd be great to learn fasting. And they do it for a very short time because they don't really have the desire that will take them further. So in the Spiritual Disciplines Handbook, the thing I try to do is say, what is your desire for God? What are you really hungry for? Because that's the fuel that will enable you to do this practice. So there's like 80 some practices in the book, but the book isn't meant for you to do 80 practices. It's meant for you to find what you're hungry for and go to that desire. And there'll be a practice to fit your desire. So
Mm.
that's as simple as I can make it.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Adele. And the other day I was reading an article, Jesus, the Liberator of Desire by Sebastian Moore, a priest from England, I think. And it was just, it was resonating with me. And this idea, I think, is so important. Alongside that element that you mentioned, we are creatures of habit. That's part of our status as human beings. And I think a lot of secular people have recognized that. You see the Atomic Habits and all these books, The Power of Habit are
Yeah.
bestsellers, but Christians haven't really, in some cases,
Mhm.
unfortunately, taken heed of that. And I think that your work addresses that lacuna, so to speak. So I'm grateful for that. And I think it is true to the Christian life, as you suggest. But I want to explore some of the specifics of your books. As you say, there's like 80 or whatever the practices, so we're not going to get them all covered, unfortunately. It's a very rich tome, and it's also a very helpful tool. I could just pick it up and practice those things one in an evening with my wife and so on. But I suppose we can touch upon some of the practices from each section. So in part one of your book, it's centered around worship, which again I think is so underappreciated, ironically, by many Christians. But you look at different elements even within that subsections of gratitude and Sabbath, visual, divine, and so on. But your section on gratitude then invites readers to cultivate an awareness of God's gifts in daily life.
Mhm.
You has practicing gratitude changed your own relationship with God?
So I think all of us who are followers of Jesus know we're supposed to be grateful, you know. And on some big level, we are very grateful. I am
Mhm.
so grateful that Jesus has died on the cross for my sin. I am grateful. But it wasn't until a very specific uh, hardship in my life that I really came to terms with gratitude, and it was life changing for me. My father died when I was in Africa visiting my son, and my um, a family member decided that uh, I had gone to Africa knowing well that my dad was on hospice and that um, they were not going to wait for me to get back for the funeral. And then they were not going to talk to me. And this is a much bigger story, but many people in my family were on my side and very, very angry. And so I knew that I could feed their anger. I knew that um, I could make myself out to be the victim. And I thought, you know, that is not what Jesus wants me to do. He does not want me to give back in kind. Here I could give back in kind. And I love the image of the electric current, because if you put in anger or uh, disgust or hatred in a current, all it can do is conduct that out to the other side, anger, hate. And I feel like often when we're triggered, we just act like an electric current. Here comes the anger and the hate, and boom, out comes mine. And Jesus acted like a water purifier. He could hold all that anger, hate, um, testing, temptation, and send forth living water. He wasn't a doormat. He didn't just absorb it and say nothing, but he did not give back in kind. On the cross, he didn't give back hatred for hatred. He didn't give back anger for anger. And in his relationship to so much of his ministry is this giving of living water. And so that's what I want to do. And I don't want to help them be angry. So I just stood with Jesus before Caiaphas, before Pilate, before Herod, and said, He said only what he needed to say, and he held his tongue, and he was that. So that was my practice, to be kind and say good things about the people that had heard me. But then I went home and I was really hurting. And I was sitting one day in my office, just feeling the pain of all the um, abandonment and sense of being losing two people in my family at one go. And I saw this book on a shelf that said 1,000 gifts. And I walked over to the book. Somebody had given it to me, and it was on gratitude. And I thought, oh, another book on gratitude. I'm not going to read another book on gratitude. But I pulled it out. It was by Ann Voskamp on gratitude. And it was about saying grateful, being grateful in very hard things. And I read the
Mhm.
book from cover to cover. And I started that day writing down everything I was grateful for every day until I got to 1,000. And that just gives you eyes to see differently. And I've done that multiple times since then, go to 1,000, because we take for granted so much of what's here. And what has gratitude done? Well, it keeps me from giving back in kind. It keeps me from being so triggered by other people. It helps me see what is good in what is going on around me and not just what is annoying and frightening and risky or whatever else. That's a long answer.
Thank you, Adele. I appreciate you sharing. That's powerful stuff. And I suppose for my next question, I'll take it out from of that micro level to macro level, framed by some of the concerns that I have with my work, with retreats and things like that. And especially, even though I appreciate the many goods of the digital world, it gives me an opportunity to speak to persons like yourself. Over the last number of years, because so much of modern technology is so addictive, I've been quite conscious about the need for some kind of Sabbath, a digital Sabbath, so to speak. And that's one of the elements in your book that you discuss, and this notion of Sabbath even more broadly, which is often overlooked or seen as difficult to practice and maybe in a hyper-connected world. How do you personally practice Sabbath, and what wisdom can you offer maybe to those who feel that they're too busy to rest in God's presence, even that one day a week?
So I think you have to have a desire, right? You have to have a desire to have some rest in your life. And I can't give you that desire, but you can ask God for that desire. I desire, and you start where you are. Can you start with 10 minutes of Sabbath and not feel guilty that it's not more? I mean, part of it is, I mean, there's lots to say about Sabbath. Lots of us are slaves to a paycheck. And, it's interesting in Egypt, where apparently they had a 10-day work week, the slaves. What's the one commandment with the one gift that they didn't have? They didn't have Sabbath. And this was a gift that they got on the other side of the Jordan. They got Sabbath. And by taking a Sabbath, you are making a statement that you are not owned, that you are a free person, that you can make choices. So to see Sabbath as this space that allows you not to be controlled by everything else around you and to step into what would be delicious for you today, what would be most life-giving for you today. How could you enjoy this moment? And we did a series of sermons back when my husband and I were co-leading a church. And we did sermons on Sabbath for 3 months. So that's 12 sermons on Sabbath in a row. And everybody went, "You're going to talk about Sabbath for 12 Sundays?" And we said, "We are." Because this is the thing you need the most help with. And, with little practices and all the small groups talking about Sabbath and all and how to observe it, to be in a community that helps support your attention to Sabbath also is a huge way of continuing to keep a flame in that desire. So for me, it's a way of saying I'm a free person. I'm a free person. God says I don't have to work all the time and I don't have to be on this blankety blank screen all the time. I don't have to. Thank you, God.
Yeah. That's lovely. Thank you so much, Adele. And I've gained so much from it personally too that I would definitely commend it to people, even as you say, if you start off with those little atomic habits of smaller, manageable pieces and build it up accordingly. And element of the Christian life, which I think is underemphasized, but again, which I have been fortunate to experience God through, is Visio Divina, divine seeing. And I think you discuss this in the book. That it's a beautiful way, I think, to engage with art and imagery. Can you give us an example of how that practice has deepened your spiritual life? And do you have any advice for maybe integrating this meaningfully amid the noise of that social and digital media consumption?
So I love this question because I'm very much a head person. I can think a lot and just sort of spin a lot. But I also am an artist, come to it late in my 40s, but always wanted to do it, but felt like it was not really doing Christian things. It's selfish to go do art. That's this whole discussion. That's wrong. But, it took me time to get there. And I think the thing about art and beauty is all it asks of us is to um, behold, to open ourselves to it. And it puts us in a place to be receptive. And for me, that's a very important piece because if you're an active person and you're always engaged in doing things and being busy and having a big life, you aren't receptive. You're out there in the world. And so that whole practice of simply being, here I am, I'm receptive. I'm receptive to this beauty. And it's just the other day I was walking, and the leaves have fallen off of most of the trees where I am, but there was this one little leaf, dangling on a tree, beautiful little leaf blowing in the wind. And just to see that and say, the leaves fall and some fall fast and some fall slow. And uh, that beautiful leaf is just hanging there. And sometimes we just hang and wait to fall. Or the other day, there were I live in a forest, there were bald eagles in the sky riding the thermals. And, mounting up on eagle's wings. There's just so much that the visual does for the soul to make it a receptive place, an open place, how God can speak to us through the birds of the air, the fish of the sea. There's a little verse, section of verses in Job. I think it's 7, where it says, let the animals teach you, let the birds of the air instruct you, let the fish of the sea tell you. Don't all of these know that the Creator made them? And it's just this beautiful little. I sometimes read it to people and say, where do you think this comes from? And they'll say, oh, Sierra Club or something like that. And go, no, this is Job telling us, like Jesus, to look at the birds because they will instruct us. The lilies will tell us, why do we need to worry about clothing? And so in the Belgic Confession of Faith, the second article says that nature is God's most elegant book. And in it are written things about God. And I think that's why so many people are drawn to nature, even if they're not feeling like they're drawn to God. But there's something about the heavens are telling.
That's delightful. Thank you so much, Adele. And recently I had a conversation with another lady from the States, Lanta Davis, and she has a book like that, Beholding and The Power of the Imagination in the Christian Life. And she referred to even the best bestiaries in the Middle Ages and how you'd have these wonderfully ornamented books with the little animals.
Illumination. Yeah,
Oh, stunning. It's
that's
so
right.
beautiful. And
It
it is
is.
there in our tradition, like that. We're blessed out in Ireland with the Book of Kells and so on. So people should attend to those things, I think, to your point, as alongside creation more broadly. And it also brought to my mind this wonderful song by Bob Dylan, actually, Every Grain of Sand. There's a lovely cover version by an African American gospel choir. And it's based on some of the similar verses that you're talking about. I'd commend that to people who'd like to sort of experience that through music also. But
Hmm.
I love this idea that you mentioned, opening yourself to God. I think that's so vital. And part two of your book actually has that. It open myself to God, and you discuss contemplation and journaling amongst other things. So I touch upon contemplation and maybe how it offers a counter rhythm, so to speak, to the pace of modern life. And you might speak to that and the role of contemplation in deepening openness to God, and maybe any challenges or graces that you faced in practicing that.
Mhm. So I think contemplation can be a stumbling word for people because they don't feel like that's the kind of person they are. And then they think it's navel gazing or uh, pointless time, wasting time, and they'd rather be doing something than um, not. Which, I mean, that's the way our world is set up, right? We are trained to be doers and we are trained to um, be distracted and find distractions for ourselves. And it's just gotten worse with all the digital availability of everything. Um, so I just want to say contemplation doesn't have to scare you. And it is a sense of being receptive to the fact that God is in this moment. That to me is the simplest, being receptive to God being in this moment. Where could God be in this moment? And even asking myself or being open to looking for where God is in the moment. That's a contemplative spirit, a receptive spirit. Now, silence and solitude are often put up as two spiritual practices that give space for contemplation. And again, I'd say you start with what you can do. And centering prayer, which is one practice, it's a contemplative practice, generally says start with 20 minutes. And I believe you can only do as you can, not as you can't. So somebody can say, do 20 minutes, but if you can't do 20 minutes, you're just going to beat yourself up. So do what you can, not what you can. And I recently did an online um, centering prayer 8-week practice. And they said, do 20 minutes. And I said, I'm going to try for 10 minutes. So I did what I could, and it was wonderful for me. But I'm not going to beat myself up because I didn't do 20 minutes. My life at this point was a 10-minute life. And there are times when your life can be a half-hour life. And then there's counting things that you might not count. So when I'm sitting or standing at an easel, I said to my spiritual director, I can feel like I'm not, oh, this is my time. This is fun. And she said, well, what if it's a spiritual practice? And I said, what do you mean if it's a spiritual practice? She said, what are you contemplating? Where is your mind? What are you thinking about? And there is a sense that when I am at an easel, I am receptive. I'm open. I'm not thinking about things. I'm being in the presence of God and of art. And so I've tried to be more intentional about saying, here is this thing I love to do. I can attend to God in a contemplative way in this space or in driving my car. That's another very contemplative place for me. No radio, no music, just silence, just nature, just all those drivers that make me go, welcome, Jesus, welcome, Jesus, welcome. You know?
So another element that I mentioned there briefly is journaling. actually. And a few weeks ago, I was sent on behalf of my workplace to a 2-day program down in the west of Ireland, which was lovely. And we learned so many different breath prayers, and journaling was part of it. And I found it a delightful discipline that really allowed for very conscientious reflection and discernment. What's maybe been the most surprising way that something like journaling has shaped your faith journey, and how it might serve those of us who, again, are immersed in consumerism and maybe without being creative for the most part in most of our lives?
So there is something, Marcus, about a spiritual practice fitting the life you have now. So for many years, even from the time I had children, journaling was just a way of saying I'm alive to bigger than to more than just the daily things. I'm alive to God in a bigger way. And it was small, but I had a practice of journaling for many, many years, even before I was married and when my children were small. And I did journaling up until the time I started writing books. And once I started writing books, I stopped journaling. And I think that writing that I did in journaling prepared me actually to be able to do the writing that I have been doing recently. And because when I'm in a book, which for many years has been almost all the time, um, it also is a contemplative practice and taking you deep into what you know about something or researching it or spending time with it. And so any of these practices, I think, weave in and out of your life. And just the way, like I have the gratitude journal that I'm doing currently, I may just write a few things in, but you do what you can. I'm currently reading my mother's journals. She's been dead over 10 years. And she wrote something every day, just about what she did. And I'm very moved to read what she wrote, but I don't want anybody reading my journals. So there you go.
Mhm. Thanks for that, Adele. And we have our distinct Christian forms of things like mindfulness, and uh, that's become something of a buzzword in primary schools. As I mentioned before we started recording, I work in primary schools, and it's often detached from its kind of distinctly Christian spiritual roots. And how does Christian mindfulness then maybe differ from the popular conception, and how does it lead us to a more maybe authentic awareness of God's presence in our lives then?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good point. You know, the thing about spiritual practices in some ways is they would do any or all of us good. You know, you don't have to be a believer to say silence would be good for your soul, solitude, Sabbath, spiritual reading, letting nature speak to you, prayer. You know, these are good things. Um, and in the Christian context, they all take on a different meaning than they do in other contexts. So, mindfulness, in some ways, you can say, so I love, somebody said this to me once, that Yahweh, the name for God, Yahweh, is the sound of breath. The sound of our life, the sound of God within us. And now we have all this science that tells you if you breathe certain ways, you can regulate your amygdala so you're not releasing cortisol and all of these chemicals that trigger you, that you actually can, through breathing, change the way you respond. And that's what they're teaching in schools here too. And I want to go, well, great, go for it. You know, we all need help, not to be triggered all the time. So it's not pagan, it's just science right there. So I want to say, and in the Christian context, it is this sense of seeing deeply, not trying to see much or see everything, but I will see deeply. I will be mindful. I will give my full attention to. I will be intentional, attentional, intentional. All these are mindful words. And so Jesus was a mindful person. He was a listening person. And when he was interrupted, he knew how to be mindful and give his full attention. Um, so mindfulness isn't just being still. It is a way of, I'm going to go back to apprehending what God is doing in the moment and being attentive, intentional, and attentional.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Adele. And another thing I appreciate about your work is the emphasis on not just private disciplines, but there are corporate disciplines which we must enter into if we want a fuller Christian life. And in part four, for example, of your book, you talk about sharing our life with others. And there's a movement of bosom we choose covenant groups, hospitality, service, and so on. So if I might take the first of those, then covenant groups, I think that from my own perspective, I have a group called an estuary group where we have a protocol that we follow, again, like you mentioned, in order not to be triggered, to respect the time, to allow the other people to speak and so on. Is an initiative from a friend of mine, also in the States, a pastor, Paul Vanderklay. And my friends and I think, have deepened our lives, our Christian lives, and in many fruitful ways, in part through that group. So I think that maybe it'll give you some context as why I find this interesting. And things like covenant groups provide space for more intentional communities. Then, how have these groups maybe impacted your spiritual life? And what advice do you have for maybe cultivating such spaces, and especially in this age of kind of disconnection, unfortunately?
Yeah. So for many years, being involved in student ministry, small groups were part of everything, small Bible study groups, small discipleship groups. I directed many camps on small groups. And at one point, I would say in my mid 40s, I was sort of burnt out on small groups because sometimes they could feel so um, affected and like there was a way you needed to be. And they didn't feel authentic, and people would argue about scripture, and I just was like, I'm done with this stuff. I don't want to be. And so we moved at that point from Boston to Chicago, and were employed by another church. And somebody I knew vaguely asked me to become part of a covenant group of 6 women who were all pastors in 6 different churches. And I said, no, I don't think so. I'm sort of done with small groups. And the woman who was leading the group was very, very wise. And she said, well, would you just consider coming once and meeting these women? They're wonderful women, and we'd love just for you to come visit one time. And, you know, I wasn't going to be an ass and say no. So I said yes. And I went to that group of those 6 women, and I was in that group for 13 years. Oh my goodness. The fact that we were all in ministry in different places, the safety of that group, the wisdom in that group, the prayer in that group got me through some really difficult things. So here I am now, recently retired, doing many things, but I was talking to the senior pastor of our church, who is a woman, who said, I don't have a safe place to talk about what it's like to be leading a church and having, men on staff that I supervise that are pastors as well, and all that. And so I said that I can do this. So last night we had our second meeting of women on the North Shore of Boston who are pastors who meet at my home for another covenant group where they can feel safe, feel seen, have space held for them, prayer for them. And it was amazing. So these things are part of what I would call good medicine. You need them to be healthy. If you're a person in ministry and don't have something like that, make it happen because it's something your soul needs. A place where you can tell the truth about yourself to people who won't go away when you tell the truth or won't be disillusioned in you because that's who you are as a pastor. You need a place for that. And I would say everybody needs a place, but I particularly feel like part of the fallen nature and the temptations of ministry, if you don't have that place, you are more susceptible to temptations.
That's excellent. Thank you. An important point. Thanks, Adele. And there's a lovely image in the work of the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks where he talks about the importance of one, face-to-face communication, and he also talks about shoulder to shoulder involvement and communicating with one another and how those things complement each other and so on. And I think that brings me in part to service and the role of service in the Christian life. This is something that, again, that group and I have been looking into. How do we go beyond that dialogos to offering service now to the community, get that rhythm? And I think it's quite clear, at least in some quarters, service is central to living out our faith. I wonder if you might share how serving others has revealed maybe more of God's love to you, and again, any practical ways that we can serve in our local communities and so on.
So some of us by nature are very given to service and we hear it and we want to do it. Some of us by our nature are just as people. That's just who we are. We want it to be fair. We want it to be good. We want it to be true. And then there are other people like me who would say, I really like to be served rather than served, which I'm sorry to say, but it's true. And so for me, the discipline of service is very important because it's not my nature. Just ask my husband. You know? So, so finding ways to be useful to other people has been important. And then I appreciate that there is more of an emphasis on justice and care for the, people on the margins that Jesus noticed in this world of Christianity than there was in my growing up world. We called that social gospel back in the old days, and that was a no-no. And I think, well, that was wrong. But I appreciate that, you know, in our faith community, we are very engaged in the community. And people have, we brainstorm about how we can minister to the community we are in. Um, every fifth Sunday, which happens about once a quarter, you get a fifth Sunday. We engage on Saturday and Sunday in doing things in our community that benefit the people that are there. And it's our worship for that. And, you know, we don't wear t-shirts. We don't say this is who we are. We just go and we have relationships with many helping organizations in our community where we can serve. We also have people who have wonderful ideas. One of the guys in our church, we have food security issues in our area. So talk to the city council about funding big food lockers that people can fill with food. And you can go to the past, they're at churches, they're at other gathering places in our community where people can come if they have food insecurity. And so I feel like there's much more creativity around how to serve and find the thing that excites you as a way to serve. So
Mm.
I do get excited. I mean, I've done a lot of teaching English as a second language, and I love doing that. And it doesn't even feel like service. It just feels like fun. So sometimes service is just fun.
Excellent. Thank God for that, Adele. And we touched upon engaging with the Bible earlier in different ways beyond just Bible study. And actually, this came quite late to me, unfortunately. My wife and I started practicing Lectio Divina, and it opened up a whole new world to us because I'd been so attentive to studying the Bible. I gained so much from Bible study and so on, but it I think opens up a complementary area that expands our vision in interesting ways and so on. So what practices for engaging with scripture have you brought you the greatest joy, depth, and the spiritual life, especially maybe at a time when people do find themselves kind of overwhelmed by information anxiety, as they talk about nowadays?
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like over my lifetime, there have been so many ways of engaging with scripture, and that early on, as a child, I loved the Bible and I read the Bible a lot. And I was practicing Lectio Divina. I was looking for something that sort of lit up for me. And I go, oh, and then I'd take that with me. I just didn't know what it was. And then I learned Bible study and stopped doing that, because Bible study was supposed to give me the truth. And then, there was inductive Bible study and evangelistic Bible studies, and I dove in 100%, love Bible study. Um, and most recently, I'd say the way that I have loved engaging with scripture, it started during COVID. I said I've been going to read the Gospels um, multiple times if necessary, but looking for how Jesus reacted and responded to people and circumstances. How Jesus reacted and responded to people and circumstances. So I wasn't particularly looking for what he was teaching. I was looking at his life. And I just have to say that has been one of the most wonderful things I've done recently. I've been through all four Gospels once. I write down everything I see him doing and how is he responding. I mean, just for instance, he gets asked the question, where do you get your authority? A million times. What an annoying question in every gospel. Where do you get your authority? And he answers it and he answers it and he answers it and he answers it in different ways. I do only what I see my Father doing. If you don't believe me, look at the works that I do. Um, and, it goes on. He has other answers as well. And you think, okay, he's just trying in some way to get them to say, we aren't really getting this. Let's ask some more questions. Um, he talks about the strong man. How can the strong man be? Oh, he's a Beelzebub. Well, let me tell you where I get my, it's a million different ways. And then finally, I think it's in Luke towards the end, he gets asked again. And I think this is the last time in that book he gets asked because the scribes and Pharisees are trying to say, how can we trap him? And they say, where'd you get your authority? And Jesus says, I'll answer your question if you answer mine. Where did John get his authority? Was it of God or was it of man? And they know that they're trapped just the way they're trying to trap him. And they say, oh, we can't answer that. And he goes, fine, bye. And I go, great. There's a time you just say, fine, bye. So just watching Jesus, I feel like if I was to write another book, that would be it. Look at the times Jesus changes his mind. Oh, what? He does, based on what people say. So I've just found it a fascinating way to be in the Gospels, just to watch him with people and circumstances. That would trigger me and how he responds.
That's tremendous. Thank you so much, Adele. And you mentioned you're there in Boston or near Boston, big city in the States, and I'm here in a little village in Ireland. I look across the road, I can see cows in the field and so on. So something that I've been considering recently is the kind of cultural mandate that seems to be part of the Christian life and how that plays out in rural contexts and how that plays out in urban contexts. We touched upon service in urban communities and so on. But I'm kind of curious, in line with part six of your book, incarnate the love of Christ, this element of stewardship and what that means. So somebody I've appreciated from the States is Wendell Berry, and I think he points to that stewardship must be beyond money and power in some ways, and it is about caring for all those things that God has given us. So how do we understand and appreciate stewardship, I suppose, and how have you done so in your own life? And maybe why does that matter so much today? With kind of we talk about the climate crisis and things like that.
Yeah. So I think that the phrase that I hear a lot is stewardship of time, talent, and treasure. And I feel like those are three very good buckets. Is my time only about me? How is any time that I have going towards others? Like the covenant group last night. I'm the oldest person in the room, all these young pastors. I mean, that is stewarding my time, giving them time. Um, how am I stewarding my time in creating a little space, this precious space for God in my life every day? How am I doing that? Then talent, you know, the 50 years of ministry, my talent is in people, being with people in formational ways. And so, or writing. So I just, I've been asked to preach next month, preach. So I just try to say, God, what can I say yes to that is doable, that I can do, not that I can't do, that I can do. And I'll do my best to do it, to be available. And so it's how available is my time so fully available that I can't even offer my talent to God. And then treasure money. But it also, I think of hospitality as a treasure. It's the giving of my home and myself to others. So, another way of looking at, so I have a little practice I've done for many, many years that has to do with just generosity. And that is time, talent, and treasure. How it gets at my generosity. How much am I about myself? How much am I a giver? So if somebody comes into my house and they say, oh, I have a bunch of angels back there. I don't know if you can see them. So they
Yeah.
might say, oh, I really like your angels. Where'd you get your angels? What about those angels? If I will listen and I will say, God, do you want me to give it away? So when people really like something, I try to give it away so that I am not attached. And just recently, somebody was in my house who really liked a very small icon I had gotten in Ethiopia, and I was quite attached to it. It was a lovely hand painted icon. And I keep thinking, well, I always say I try to practice giving it away. And so this person said they liked it. I said, oh, I'm glad you do. And they were there for a couple hours, and I kept feeling God go.
Mhm.
So I stuck it in her purse when she left. She found it when she got home. It's about, will I be generous with the things I'm attached to? Time, talent, and treasure.
Seven of your book, you look at prayer, and we mentioned breath prayer before, but you also bring fasting to the fore. I wanted to touch upon that. It's a discipline that's often seen, I think, as challenging, but it's
Which one?
fasting.
Fasting.
Yeah,
Fasting.
because
Okay.
it's seen as so challenging, but it is mentioned, it seems, even more times in the Bible than baptism. And what role has fasting played in your own journey with God and how it can transform our lives in unexpected ways? I suppose, again, like the habits that we're talking about, this is now in secular culture more broadly, but in Christian context, how do we go beyond even just the physical element, which has become something of a fad recently?
Yeah. So fasting. Again, I feel like there are many ways to fast. And growing up, I only knew that fasting was about food. And so, you'd go on a retreat and you'd fast from a meal and give the money that should have gone to that meal to some, there were ways that they tried to get us as children involved in the discipline of fasting. And then you find out, that it's good to fast, and going 18 hours without food can be very good. And so you have all these people who do now just physical fasting because it's better for their bodies. Um, but fasting for a particular thing, fasting, repenting in with fasting and ashes. I mean, there is a fasting that is about sorrow and repentance, and there is a fasting that is a pleading with God for things, and praying for the world, or praying and giving money that you would otherwise eat to, or use to feed yourself to. So I think food is a major thing in our country, and we eat way more than we need to, but um, fasting can be a really good practice that is just about um, taking in only as much as I need. It is about being able to listen to my body and say, this much is what is needed, and I don't need more. And our country, our world says you need more. Oh, you always need more. Why would you not need more? And then I also think that for some people, um, fasting is not something their bodies can take or do. And so it's not like they can't fast. You can fast from technology. You can fast from watching TV. You can fast from criticizing somebody. You can fast from um, uh, driving your car and ride your bike. There are ways that you limit yourself. All these are limiting things so that you use only what is needed. And that simplicity can actually open you to a different way of apprehending your world. So there are times like during Lent, fasting is a good Lenten practice. It's from the beginning. And yet for me, fasting from food would not do nearly as much as one year for 40 days, I fasted from interrupting. I mean, and I did that because my husband for 25 years had said, do you realize how often you interrupt? And I always said, no, I don't. I thought, okay, well, I'll it didn't turn out well. I saw how I interrupted because I had an idea that I wanted to stick in my oar and to fast from speaking, to mute myself. I would have this pearl and the conversation would move. And by the time there was a place to speak that wasn't interrupting, that place where this would fit was gone. And I saw, oh, I am listening for me and what I have to say. That did me a whole realm of good to just fast from interrupting.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Adele. And we're not going to get through all the practices today, as I mentioned, but I commend people now to go and buy and read your book. And I suppose to close for today, then, what encouragement would you offer to those of us who are feeling overwhelmed by the demands of daily life, for seeking to deepen our connection with God through the spiritual disciplines? And what sort of invitation would you extend to those folks?
So I would say do anything that doesn't lead you to love God and worship God. Doesn't matter how good it is. If it's not leading you there, find the thing that leads you to God, the thin place, and be there.
I'm into that. That's beautiful. Where can my viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work then, finally?
Sorry?
Where can my viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work then?
We have a website called Calhoun Ministries. It's a very unexpansive website, but you'll find out, where we're speaking and what we're doing and things like that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and God bless you and your ministry too.
Thank you, Marcus.
I'm going there. No